Hi everyone, welcome back. We're going to jump straight in where we left off on that really long video just before. So I've got my UV template. I'm just going to shut that off. I'm going to open up Photoshop. I've already got it open here, and I'll just bring back my folder. So I'm going to dump that template into Photoshop just there. And you can see what it's done. It's basically, because it's a PNG file that I exported out of Maya, it's actually created the background as transparent by default. It hasn't added it in as a channel. It's purely just not ever rendered that background. So I've got this transparent thing. So this is my template layer. And because you can't really see the lines in the thumbnail, the first thing that generally I do is set this up with a new name. And you can either call it temp, like we did with the file, or usually what I tend to do is just call it OL for outline. Okay, but you can do whatever makes sense to you. Call it whatever makes sense. Alright, so then what I do is I create a background layer. So I just create a new layer, clicking on the button down here, and just drag this down underneath. Now if you want, what you can do is actually lock this layer, this template if you want, or you know, maybe lock the transparency or something like that. That's up to you, okay? As long as you don't draw on this layer or mess this layer up, and in particular, you don't want to move this layer. At the very least, you probably should lock the movement for this layer by clicking this little button. That way, if you're moving things around on your paint layers, you can't accidentally move this around. It'll just do this. Can't move it because it's locked. All right. Now down here on your background layer, okay. Now usually, you know, you can just call that BG for background, okay? Normally what I would do is fill this with black. The problem with that is that my lines are black, and if I obviously fill them, the background with black, I can't see the lines anymore. So what I might do for the time being is just fill them with white, okay? Your other option is you can fill it with black if you like, and then just invert the lines. I might do that actually. So I'm just going to hit Paint Bucket. I've got black, so I'll just press D to reset my colors. And you need to make sure that all layers up here is switched off. Okay, otherwise it will only fill in sort of around the line. So just fill that in like that. I'll then grab the outline layer and come up to Image Adjustments, Invert, which is Command or Control I, and that will change the lines to white. So now we can see what we're doing. Generally speaking, you would tend to have a black background on your textures. It's a pretty common thing. It's not absolutely vital, but it's probably quite a common occurrence based on the texture artists' work that I've seen and what I tend to do myself. Right, so from this point on, really, what you do with this texture is up to you. Obviously, it's going to be dependent on the kind of texture you're trying to create. You know, if you're building a dragon, you might want to try and paint dragon scales in, or maybe use some, like a picture of some lizard skin or something like that. You can drag photo samples in. You can pretty much sort that out however you want. Just to give you an idea about the kind of stuff that you can sample, I've got a textures folder here with all these different types of textures. Some of these are commercial textures I've bought, some are textures I've gotten for free from the internet or from CG magazine sample discs and things like that. Generally speaking, most 3D artists will build up a huge collection like this of textures. I've got some of these commercial ones here we can have a quick look at. So I've got creature scales, for example. So, you know, for example, we could use, if we're doing like a lizard, we could use something like this and basically drag that in and then sample it over the top of some of our areas. I might actually do that just for this example, just so we can kind of see. So I'm just going to drag that over into Photoshop, and we'll just separate that out into its own little window like that, and I can drag the background from this image into this document here, and it'll pop up over there. Then I can close that off. So I've got my background, and then I've got sort of layers of whatever I want. So with this, you know, we can just kind of transform this. I'm not going to kind of spend kind of time explaining what I'm doing in Photoshop, purely because you know, it's sort of not really the focus of this this video. This is just a means to an end, just to get some form of texture into Maya, really. So if, let's say I want the scales to be this big, and I just want to fill this area in, just here, just this side. Obviously, at this point, the texture is overlapping here, and it's overlapping here and here and so on. Okay, what I would usually do is mask this layer off, just here. Okay, there's a couple of ways we can do this. Both are non-destructive. Okay, so I'm not actually going to delete the excess areas. What I'm going to do is hide them. There's two ways we can do this. Both involve the Polygon Lasso tool. So under the Lasso tool, okay, you'll find the polygonal lasso tool just here. All right, and basically what you want to do, I'm going to hide this layer for a second. What you want to do is click a line or click a selection following just outside the shape that you're trying to fill in. Now when you've got, obviously when you've got straight edges like this, if you hold shift, it will constrain the selection. Whoops, now that just jumped by itself. So I'm definitely having some form of issue with this software at the moment. Okay, so basically I've got that selection. So you can either create a layer mask for this layer. Okay, if I turn that back on, if I click this button, it will mask the outer area of the selection. Anything outside of the selection it will hide. It's still there. If I right click on here and hit disable layer mask, you can see there it kind of turns it off temporarily and it all comes back. Alright, so with it enabled, basically you can see what I've done is cropped that texture area so it's only covering this area of polygons, this particular shell. It's not overlapping anything else, but you can see how I've actually left several pixels of overlap outside the polygon shell area. You don't want to trim right on the line, because quite often that line is actually part of the polygon and you end up with like black edges. You end up with like little black gaps on your model and the lines show up when you render. So you always want to overlap slightly with your texture. Okay, I might dump some text on something else. So I might go sort of like another sickly green, and let's just pick a random font here. Let's try that. So let's go with, I'm going to go up here and I'll just type in snake. Just hit enter. Alright, so I've got some text up there. Now you can obviously fill in everything else. What I might do is just pause the recording for a second and just fill in everything else with something, just so we can kind of get a bit of a grip on what's actually occurring when we load this onto the model. So I'll see you in a second. Okay, we're back and you can see that I've filled all these areas in with horrid colours. And basically what we're going to do is save this out and load it into the object's material over in Maya. Now there's one thing I want to point out. I've deliberately kind of made an error on this image, and it's just here. Okay, what I've done is allowed the fill that I've created for this rectangular area to actually overlap onto part of the shell for this section of the model. So we've got this little bit of green overlap here. So that's deliberate, and I'm going to show you why that's a problem in a second. So assuming that we've kind of correctly named all of our layers, which I haven't done here to save time, obviously. So you know, you basically make your layers all neat and tidy as you normally would when you're working in Photoshop. So what we're going to do is save this. So the first thing I do is I turn off the outline. Okay, if that's left on and you save this and you import it into Maya, basically the lines show up on your model, and that's not what we want. If it is what you want, then perfectly fine, go ahead. But usually you wouldn't. Okay, so we turn that off. Then we save the file. So just Command S or Control S, or go to File, Save. It'll prompt you to save in the Images folder again. What I tend to do at this point is I go over to my Source Images folder and save it here. The reason for that is that this is where Maya is going to look for the texture. So if you save the PSD in here, when you save the import version for Maya, it'll also just save directly into here as well. So what we're going to do here is we're going to call this, whatever the name is, for me I'm just calling this demo. I'm going to call this color. The reason for that is that this is the color image for my model. This is what's going to add color to the object. Now there are other types of maps, things like reflection, things like specularity maps, bump maps, normal maps, and so on. Each of those adds a specific type of effect to the surface of your model. Okay, and they might be, some of them, like a bump map, for example, might just be a grayscale image. Okay, not color. Things like normal maps have a specific color scheme they use, which is sort of like a combination of purple, blue, magenta, green. They kind of look really weird. And things like specularity maps and so on might have various contrasted colors and black and white and so on. What we're doing is really just adding color. So we'll go color and make sure that we've got PSD. Now I saved the PSD, so if I have to come in and edit the texture, which is really common to have to do, you always quite often end up having to make tweaks. Keep the PSD version so you can kind of manipulate the layers. So we just save it as a PSD. In order to import it into Maya, we don't want to load a PSD because the file size can be really huge. And depending on what we're rendering with from Maya, it doesn't always recognize PSD files. So what we want to do here is save as. So we go File, Save As. And what we want to do is just change the file format. Keep the name the same so you can match which texture file goes with which PSD. And generally what we can do here is just go with a JPEG or a PNG, a Targa, something like that. PNGs and Targas will have or can have alpha channels embedded, so you can get transparency working as well in Maya based on your pictures, but we don't really need that at the moment. I'm just going to go with a PNG. We'll just hit save and just hit it OK for whatever options pop up. Okay, so that's all saved. What we want to do now is jump back over to Maya. So here's our object where it left off. Okay, I don't need the template, so I'm just going to hit spacebar and dive into here. Now we've already got this texture here loaded with this checkerboard. I don't need that texture anymore, but I'm not going to kind of overwrite it. What I'm going to do is just add a new texture to the object. So I'm going to go File, Add Favorite Material, and you can choose whatever material you want. I'm just going to go with another Lambert. The attributes will pop open, and I'm going to call this Block Snake Shader. Okay, that's kind of the theme that I did with that texture. Alright, so when we get that, what we need to do is load the picture into the correct channel over here on our shader. And it was a color map, so I'm going to load it into the color material attribute just here. So, first of all, if you click this little button textured or press 6 on the keyboard, when you load the image in, it will appear in the viewport. If you haven't got 6 pressed already, you can still load the image in, but it won't show up on the model. So to load the image, we click the input, and we get this create render node. What we want to do is select file. Okay, now there is a PSD file here. I don't want to use that one because I'm not using the PSD. I'm going to use just a regular file. Now you'll note here that the color changes on the object because there's no file loaded yet. Next to image name, we go across to the folder, click it. That will go straight to the source images folder in our project folder. And you can see now the project folders, it's a little bit more clear now why they are so important. Basically, the software is looking in specific locations in your project folder for certain files. You can see my horrible green texture just here. That's the file I want. So demo color, color, this matches the attribute that we were loading it into. So we'll just hit open. And there it is. It appears on the object. You can see the thumbnail in here. So that's the coloring that I've just added. Okay. If we have a look under here, you can see that text actually runs across multiple polygon surfaces like that. Now, if we'd have just taken this object and planar projected it from the bottom, what we would have ended up with is this text showing up exactly as it is, but instead of it kind of just being blank here, there would have been green streaks across here to connect this little piece of green at the end of the K to the rest of it. So there would have been like a bright green streak across here. But we've avoided that by creating a UV template. So you can see the way that this is working now. So let's look at that error. You can see up here, I'm actually getting a piece of this green that's coming off a different section of the template. From memory, it's actually coming off the edge of, it's actually coming off the corner of this, I think, from memory. Or the back, just here. I think it's actually the back of this. So even though they're in completely different spots, part of the texture from here is actually bleeding across onto here. Okay, if I tap my spacebar, get my UV template back, and I select the object, if I press this button here, it will display the texture. And I can actually locate areas that are causing the problems. So I can see here, this corner, that's where the overlap is, which I can see here. So with that in mind, what I would have to do is go back into Photoshop and actually erase that piece of green. So let's do that. Let's jump back over to Photoshop. I can turn on my outline again and kind of identify where it is. So if I'm not sure, I can jump across to Maya. If it lets me jump. Okay, come on. There we go. So I can have a look over here. So on my model, for example, if I don't know where on the template it is, what I can do is go, okay, well, it's this polygon. I've just found this error. I'll select face and select this, and then it'll highlight over here. So I go, okay, well, that's the polygon. And you can kind of zoom in and look for it. So that way you know whereabouts on the template the problem is. And then over in Photoshop, all you do is you look for that area. So over here, I know that it's sort of this area, just here, and there it is. So now all I need to do is identify what layer it's on, and usually, obviously, you would have these named, you know, based on what you've got in the layer. I know that it's layer 2. I can see that there. I can turn that on and off. So really all I need to do is kind of select that corner and delete it. So I'm just going to grab my polygonal lasso tool and whoops, just make a selection just there and delete. Make sure I'm on the right layer first. That removes it. There's no green overlapping into this shell now. So all I have to do now is turn the outline back off. Just save that, Control S, and then go File, Save As. So File, Save As. Set it to PNG again. That was the format that I used. And hit Save. It'll ask you to overwrite. Just say OK. And say OK. And then all we do is jump back over to Maya when it finishes saving. There we go. Now you'll notice it hasn't updated. Maya does not automatically update your images. So what you need to do to update is select the object. Okay, now sometimes you can just double click this thumbnail and it will update. Sometimes what you can do is go into the color channel. If this is still open, if you go into here, you can just press reload or double click this sample. So if I double click that, it updates the image, it reloads the image in, and you can see now that error has disappeared. And that's the basic gist. So that's how we can apply very specific images or parts of images onto very specific sections of models. Okay, now it works for round objects, you know, cylindrical objects, whatever you need to template. Don't forget, you can select parts of an object, okay, polygons, and just template that selection of polygons. If it's a kind of an odd shape, it'll work with characters, it'll work with vehicles, any objects at all. So that's just a very, very rudimentary, basic fundamental look at the UV template creation, and really very quickly and roughly how to apply an image into a material and get it to display on your objects. So primarily the quality of your textures is going to be based primarily on two things: the way that you've set up and projected your UV template, and sort of whether or not you've managed to reduce the amount of stretching or distortion on your template, and also how much time you spend on your textures when you're using Photoshop. Keep in mind at this point, if you select any UVs on this template and you move them around like this, it will start to distort your textures. So you have to basically avoid playing around with your UVs too much. You can actually use this to fix little tweaked problem areas. So for example, if you've got like something like this, where we're getting this little kind of sliver of black, you can always just grab a UV and just kind of drag it back into position to get rid of that black area. So you can kind of tweak them a little bit once they're done. Sometimes you might need to. So it really just depends on the circumstances. So with that said, I'm going to leave this video here. Good luck with all your texturing and your UVs. Obviously practice makes perfect, and just keep in mind, as a final thought, creating a UV template for a complex model can oftentimes take just as long as actually modeling the object to begin with. It's really a complex process, and don't underestimate the amount of time it takes to create UV templates, especially if you're under a deadline. You need to set quite a lot of time out for it. I would say almost as much time as the modeling phase of your production. So with that said, I'll see you later.